Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Now, I have not produced any content over the course of the last few days. I've been very, very busy, and I do apologize for not having the time to produce said content. Now, however, today's a new day, and we are starting off fresh, and hopefully you will enjoy today's production. Now, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, today I want to take a journey back in time. This episode is to help facilitate the education of the uninformed urbanite here in the United States and to some extent Western Europe and other nation states. Now, if you were to ask most uninformed urbanites here in the United States, why is there a war in Europe? Well, the rebuttal will be that Russia invaded the Ukraine. Now, when you ask a person what is the Ukraine, they will then tell you that it is a nation state that in all probability has existed for an extended period of time. And that's part of the problem here in the United States. And it goes into the school systems of the United States. It goes into the indoctrination processes. School systems in the United States, grade schools, do not teach history. And if they do teach history, they teach a politically correct, revised history centered on race and identity. That is what the schools do today here in the United States. So most kids, adults, coming out of these institutions of indoctrination do not have the ability to tell you what the world looked like during the Cold War. Furthermore, they don't have the ability to tell you what the world looked like prior to the Cold War. And I'm talking going back before World War II. It's essentially non-existent. It is a non-existent thought process for most of Gen Z, millennials, and especially those that are in the grade school system as we speak, and even obviously in the college systems as well. But what I want to do is take a quick trip back into history, and let's go back over to the map of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Most people, if you talk about the war in Ukraine, if you talk about the quote-unquote Russian invasion of the Ukraine, they are not aware that the Ukraine was part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This part of history has been purged. It's gone. No one talks about it. Even the end of the Cold War and what happened after is really not discussed. It's the here, it's the now. It's this quote-unquote Russian invasion of this state that apparently has been omnipresent since the beginning of time, which is simply not true. Now let's have a look at Eastern Europe prior and post to the onset of World War II. Fairly small map. Well, you'll just have to bear with me. So the dark red area is the Soviet Union prior to 1938, prior to the onset of the Second World War. And then after the Second World War, you can see the Soviet client states, East Germany, the Republic of Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Republic of Hungary, the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, the People's Republic of Albania, the People's Republic of Bulgaria, and the Romanian People's Republic. Now you can see here this line that cuts straight through Belarus and the borderlands of this area here. The area east, Kiev, Kharkov, the Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, all parts of the traditional, what was the Soviet Union. The only part that could possibly be called the Ukraine, the borderlands, would be Lviv in the west. Maybe. Now fast forward to the end of the Cold War. Fast forward. We are now have transported ourselves from the 1930s to present day. Now, let's hypothetically develop a time machine. And we are going to take the stakeholders of the Soviet Union just prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We're going to take Gorbachev. We're going to take the heads of the Politburo, the heads of the Soviet military. And we are going to transport them into the future to today. Today. Deep state map. And we would show them, better yet, let's go to this, the Rondelli Foundation map. And we are going to show them this map. Again, the stakeholders of the Soviet Union towards the end of the 1980s, on the cusp of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Matter of fact, we will go into the conversations that took place between, let's say, Secretary of State Baker and other officials in Western Europe and the United States that talked about NATO expansion, and NATO had no interest whatsoever into moving into areas such as Poland, Romania. Now fast forward. Those stakeholders, after having that reassured conversation with NATO and United States officials, are then transported into the present day. And what do they see? They see Poland. They see Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, Hungary, the partition of Czechoslovakia. Let's go back to this map, remember, okay? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania was part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. If you would have mentioned in the 1980s that the Baltic states would become part of NATO, I promise you, with 100% certainty, we all may not be here today. There would have been war. In all probably, nuclear war. The areas in pink, Soviet client states, most of which were in the Warsaw Pact. All of these states, or most of these states, are now part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Once that was accomplished, once all of these border states, or these Eastern European states that were at once, again, client states of the USSR, once they were incorporated into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the only way east for NATO expansion was the actual main body of the USSR. And again, those conversations about the possibility of NATO membership of Poland, those early conversations, there was a great deal of hesitancy. And if you would have mentioned that eventually NATO would expand into the USSR, and then finally, the nail in the coffin, active consideration of the Ukraine into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Cold War would have never ended. You understand that? Let's be clear about that. If you are an uninformed urbanite, the Cold War would have never ended, and in all probability, it would have turned into a hot war, given the current situation in hindsight. If you could go back and you could see into the future what is happening now, in terms of the thought processes of then, again, the 1980s, the end of the Soviet Union. What is happening now, or has happened, in all probability, is the worst case scenario for those old Soviet stakeholders. Now, you would think a reasonable person would believe that if the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had accomplished its objectives in terms of getting Poland, getting Hungary, the breakup of Czechoslovakia, and then eventually the entrance of the Czech and Slovak republics into NATO, the breakup of the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, then becoming Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia. NATO forces in Romania. Long-range radar and missile systems designed to shoot down Russian systems over Russia. That would have never happened. The breakup would have never happened. Now, after this is achieved, what is next? Well, we know what's next because we then observed it happen. That is the acquisition of the Baltic states. Again, the Overton window. What is insane, say in the 70s and the 80s, no one would have believed the Baltic states would have become part of NATO. A cataclysm would have to occur, and it wasn't even on the radar. Now Ukraine, the borderlands. Let's say we have a ceasefire. And let's say hypothetically that what exists of the Ukraine is then at some point accepted into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is the course, that is the track, that is the pathway that history is currently on. So let's say next the Ukraine becomes part of NATO or becomes a NATO client state, meaning it may not be officially part of NATO, but it is fully armed and backed and trained by NATO. So again, we've pushed east. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Again, originally designed to prevent a Warsaw Pact Soviet invasion of Western Germany. Now you have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the Ukraine, now part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You have to ask yourself what comes next, especially if you're a Russian. Because even after NATO had pushed all the way east to the borders of the Soviet Union, that was not a stopping point. So you have to ask yourself, is there a NATO expansion stopping point? And to answer that question, the perception of the average Russian and the average stakeholder in the Kremlin is there is no stopping point. There is no stopping point. If NATO moves into the Ukraine and the Baltic states, there's no reason to believe that NATO will not then attempt to expand further east, and that will require what? The breakup of the Russian Federation. Now you'll say, when I say that, oh, that's ridiculous. That's impossible. NATO would not seek to do that. Well, look, there was a period of time where it was inconceivable that NATO would move into the actual Soviet Union. Again, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Ukraine. Now, the problem with this is that, especially when it comes to the Ukraine, it is Russian. You can argue that on a map you can see this state that appears to be a state, but is it? Most Ukrainians speak Russian. Many Ukrainians are from Russia, having been born in Russia. Or the opposite way, you have many Russians that were born in the Ukraine. They simply ended up in the Ukraine because their parents worked at factories or were in the military or what have you, the borderlands. But it was never seen as this separate entity, especially the eastern Ukraine, the area where the fighting is happening right now. There was a reason that there was a civil war and a breakaway of these lands in the eastern borderlands. They were Russians. They did not want to be part of this new entity. And then here we are. But again, just imagine the stakeholders of the Soviet Union back in the 1980s having the opportunity to look at what is happening now. And the question is, what would the world look like if those old Soviet stakeholders knew this was to happen? We would not have seen the end of the Cold War. In all likelihood, we would have seen the outbreak of World War III. Now, here we are today. A new administration in the White House. We are on the onset of the possibility that the United States will suspend, at least for 90 days, all military resources, all military assistance, and there will be a review of exactly what is being sent where. So essentially, for 90 days, that could prevent the United States from continuing to supply the Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, as we watch what is happening in Russia right now, and specifically on the military front, the Russian military is in the process of a monolithic military buildup. What is being signaled by the Kremlin in the Russian Federation is the understanding that this NATO expansion has to end with the Ukraine. And that is why the Russians cannot allow for the eventual takeover of Ukraine by NATO. Because again, what's next is the breakup of the Russian Federation. From the Russian perception, there's no reason to believe that there will not be further expansion by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization east, and the only way east is into Russia proper. Absolutely. So from the Russian perspective, they cannot lose this war. And given the resources, given the capabilities, given the monies being spent right now, I think the Russians are reevaluating the original military objectives at the start of this conflict. I think the Russians are preparing themselves to extend this conflict until we see the eventual collapse of the Ukrainian proxy forces through a war of attrition. Now, this is going to be a very important next 90 days. And then going into spring and then finally summer of this year. This battlefield could rapidly change. Rapidly change. A lot right now is hinging on what is happening in and around Pokrovsk. The Russians are enveloping this town from the west, from the south, and to the east. Now, once Pokrovsk falls, it's going to have a cascading effect. Probably more severe than the original fall of Avdiivka. Once Avdiivka fell, again, a massive collapse of these western lines of defense for Ukrainian forces. At the same time, the Russians are continuing operations near Kupiansk. Torsk has fallen, and the Donbas offensive continues. The Russian military capacity is in full swing. They are producing up to 5 million artillery rounds a year now, vastly outproducing all of Western Europe and the United States. Tank production, armored infantry fighting vehicle production, aircraft production, the apex predator of war right now, the drone system. Those are being produced by the thousands upon thousands a month. And it's going to continue. We will see the continued expansion of the Russian military until, in all probability, becomes the second largest military on Earth. And why is it doing this? Again, it cannot allow a NATO victory in the Ukraine because they understand, again, their perception is, and perception is reality, that what happens next is a NATO move east. And again, if we go back to the acquisition of Poland into NATO, and what was said in terms of there will be no further movement east. Once Poland is taken, we promise. And then obviously look where we're at. No guarantees. So I don't think the Russians can stop this war. I don't believe the Russians can discontinue military operations, in all probability, until the border looks somewhat like this. So what does that mean? That would mean that this is what remains of the Ukraine. Maybe a capital in Lviv, in this area here. And in all probability, everything east of the Dnepr River, including Kiev, Odessa, Kryvyi Rih, Mykolaiv, the Russians take control over. Now, obviously, it's not going to happen today. It's not going to happen within the next 60 days. But this war could last another 3 years. And in 2 years, the battlescape, the lines of contact could change dramatically. And again, you have to go back to what, and ask yourself, what is the Russian war goal? The Russian war goal is to prevent NATO expansion into what remains of the Ukraine. How does it do that? It has to permanently defeat the Ukraine and occupy territory. As always, thanks for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.